Episode 1 of the School Psych Finds podcast, What is a School Psychologist? Welcome to School Psych Finds, the podcast, a show where we'll explore various topics related to the fields of psychology, education, human development, and of course, school psychology. I'm your host, Sophia, a nationally certified school psychologist, and these are my School Psych Finds. Welcome back to the School Psych Finds podcast. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about what a school psychologist is. Now, that on the surface seems like a simple and obvious question to answer, but you'll be surprised to hear that it's actually quite challenging and something that a lot of school psychologists struggle to answer in a short, easy description. It sounds like a school psychologist is just a psychologist that chooses to work in schools, or maybe just like a school counselor with some more training or a therapist in the school, but it's nowhere near that simple or even accurate. School psychology is an entire career field in itself with its own specialized training. School psychologist is an actual job title versus just a description of where a psychologist works. So on today's episode of School Psych Finds, we're finally going to be trying to answer the question of what is a school psychologist. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. So unless you're a school psychologist, you might not truly understand how absurdly difficult it is to answer what a school psychologist is in a comprehensive way that doesn't take an hour to explain. Today we're going to describe who school psychologists are, a brief day in the life of a school psychologist, what areas we're trained in, where we work, who we work with, and some quick information about our salary and workloads. A quick disclaimer, school psychology varies so much nationally across the United States. There are a lot of areas that we all have in common, especially in regards to our training, but because the laws governing our jobs are so different across states, things can really be different for each school psychologist. Things can also vary by the district the school psychologist practices in, as well as their own training and then their own desire of how they want to practice school psychology. One of the reasons that it's difficult to answer the question of what is a school psychologist is because there's a really big difference between training and reality. So what we're trained to be able to do and all the areas we have a lot of knowledge in and should be able to work in, and what the reality of public education and our practices are today. So there's a huge shortage of school psychologists nationally, and it's not a new problem, and it's continuing to be a problem. So this really limits our roles in a lot of places because we have to focus on what our legally mandated jobs and timelines require versus all the different things we're able to do. The other thing is most people don't really know what a school psychologist is, even including the people that we work with. And so that further limits our roles because people just might not know all the things that we're trained in and the areas of expertise that we have and how valuable it could be to consult and collaborate with a school psychologist. Here's my quick elevator pitch trying to describe what a school psychologist is when kind of the average person asks me what I do for a living. So I tell them that my job as a school psychologist is to help figure out how kids learn best and to work with all the different people in their lives, like their family and school staff, to help support them in the best way possible. And generally that's through things like identifying any disabilities and cognitive evaluations, and then of course the mental health supports that come along with this job, like counseling and helping schools to establish school-wide practices that support students. I help to identify common things that people have heard of like ADHD and dyslexia, autism, learning disabilities, intellectual disabilities, and a bunch of other things. So that is my general overview explanation of what a school psychologist is. And now I'm going to read to you what our national organization, which is known as NASP, the National Association of School Psychologists, how they describe what a school psychologist is. I highly recommend anyone who's interested in school psychology to go to their website. I'll leave that in the show notes, and they have a ton of information and data about school psychology. So our national organization's definition of a school psychologist is that we are uniquely qualified members of school teams that support students' ability to learn and teachers' ability to teach. They apply expertise in mental health, learning, and behavior to help children and youth succeed academically, socially, behaviorally, and emotionally. School psychologists partner with families, teachers, and school administrators and other other professionals to create safe, healthy, and supportive learning environments that strengthen connections between home, school, and the community. So with both of those definitions, that might give you some more general insight into what our career field is, but it still might leave you wondering but what does that actually look like in practice? Like, that all sounds wonderful, but it's very global and general, that you're just supporting students. Our national organization has 10 broad domains that we're expected to be experts in, and 10 is really a lot when you're thinking that they're all different domains, and they all have a ton of subfields associated with those domains that we're also supposed to be experts in. Let me just briefly tell you about where we work, who we work with, and a couple other things. The vast majority of school psychologists work in the public education system. So in kindergarten through high school public schools, and that also often includes preschools or early childhood identification centers. Every public school has access to a school psychologist, and this is something a lot of people don't know. I often, unfortunately, hear people saying, I didn't know my school had a school psychologist, I didn't know school psychologists existed, or that my school didn't have a school psychologist. And that's very likely not accurate, but it's completely understandable why they wouldn't have known that. There is a huge shortage of school psychologists, like I said earlier, and so most of us are spread across multiple schools, 2, 3, 5, even 10 or more. I think the average would probably be 2 to 3, but that varies again across states and districts. The recommended ratio is 1 school psychologist for at most 500 students, and nationally we are nowhere near close to meeting that. The national average is 1 school psychologist for every 1,200 students, and it's even worse in many places because that's just an average. Now, private schools could have school psychologists, but they're not required to have them. School psychologists also work in universities and colleges as instructors and professors. Some of us are able to go into private practice depending on the state and the training that you have. We work in administrative offices, both in supervising other school psychologists, but also helping to lead district-wide practices. And then some of us work in hospitals and juvenile detention programs. But again, remember, the vast majority of us are working in the public education system. Now, who do we work with? This goes back to the shortages of school psychologists. We are trained to be able to work with all students. So that's general education students and students with disabilities and special education. However, because of the shortages nationally, a lot of us are not able to practice comprehensively. And so what that leaves us with is working primarily with the special education population, because that is where most of the legal timelines and requirements are. And we'll get into that a little bit more later on in this episode. But we're able to work with all students, and a lot of us really enjoy being able to do that. Our primary clients, so to speak, are students and their success. Now, in order to effectively support students, we have to work with the stakeholders in their lives. And so that would be all educational staff like teachers and administrators. We have to work with their families and their parents, and then of course community providers as well. So we often do consultations and collaborations with them. Now, what is a typical day in the life of a school psychologist? Another trick question, because every single day is different in the life of a school psychologist. You will never be bored as a school psychologist. Your options for the setting that you work in are pretty much endless in terms of, like I said, anywhere from early childhood identification centers, elementary school, preschool, middle school, high school, continuation school, and then there's a bunch of different settings that you could work in terms of public education, sometimes private school, but also public day schools like private schools for kids with special education needs and things like that. This is a very rewarding career, and you get to help kids and families, and it's really meaningful. But it's also very fast-paced, very busy. There's a high stress load and a high burnout rate. Again, because of the shortages, we often have caseloads that are really high and difficult for us to meet, but we all try our best. Now, in an average day, our job might look something like conducting evaluations and assessments of students, and that includes IQ testing, analyzing that data, report writing, which can take a really long time as well. We're in a lot of meetings for a variety of purposes, school-wide meetings, special education meetings, meetings with families who are concerned about their children. We do counseling, and we can do that on an individual level, on a group level, on a class-wide level, and we do counseling as related services for children with IEPs. There's a lot of paperwork and documentation involved in our job. We do spend a great deal of time documenting things, planning things, organizing things. And we also do a lot of consultations with, again, the stakeholders in that student's life. So like with parents, with teachers, and administrators. We also support behavior needs, and this varies by the setting that you're in, what kind of behavior needs, but we're experts in analyzing behavior and helping put in intervention plans into place. We also help with crises, and so this could be being on a crisis team in terms of preventing crises from happening, responding to crises, and also the recovery phases of crises. And we also, on a typical day, would help connect families to community resources. Now, what is the training required to be a school psychologist? A school psychologist is a really unique field in psychology because it's one of the only professions where in most states you're allowed to use the title psychologist without holding a doctoral level degree. Again, the vast majority of school psychologists hold what's called a specialist level degree. And you can think about this as a step between a master's degree and a doctoral degree. It usually takes about 3 years to complete, and it's usually about 60 credits, including a year-long 1,200-hour supervised internship in the field. A lot of us also have practicum hours, and just to give you some context, a master's degree is typically about 40 credits, and then the specialist level degree would be about 60, and a doctoral degree is about 90. So that's why I say it's about a step in between. A lot of school psychologists also have doctoral degrees, it's just nowhere near the amount as the specialist level degree, and some people get confused with this because in some states they don't offer what's called an education specialist degree, and so a lot of psychologists have a master's degree with additional credentials, and that is considered a specialist level degree. So I just want to make sure that that's clearly stated. In terms of salary, this is another sticky topic that people get a little bit riled up about, but nationally, the average salary for a school psychologist is $74,000 a year. I like to round that up to make it simple, $75,000 per year. But it varies greatly, just like everything else in the field of school psychology, by the state you're in, the district you work in, and then of course, just like any other job, by the experience you have. The interesting thing to remember about that salary is that it's $75,000 a year for the days we're contracted for. So school psychologists do get breaks during summer and winter and fall, unless they've asked to be a 12-month employee. So the average amount of days that a school psychologist is contracted for is 195. Again, that varies, but just to give you some context, because by itself 195 doesn't mean a lot, but the average employee who doesn't work in public education works around 260 days per year. So 260 minus 195, that's about 2 months more of time off. Now, a lot of people kind of ask about like, well, are you paid during that time off? No, you're a salaried employee, so for your contracted days, this is the salary you get, so that's $75,000 kind of regardless of when you're working. Some districts do spread your paycheck out over 12 months, but that's just a personal choice. You're not technically paid for those days that you have off. You're just not working during that time. All right, so let's get into just a little bit deeper about some of the things we're trained in and are able to do. In terms of mental health supports, like I said, a lot of it is that crisis prevention, response, and recovery. So we're trained in best practices in understanding suicide and self-harm, and we do something called suicide risk assessments. And so that is when a student is experiencing suicidal ideations, we're trained in being able to evaluate them to assess a level of risk so we can help communicate to their families and the school about what kinds of supports they're going to need. We can also do that in regards to threat assessments when any student makes a threat. Sometimes we're able to be involved in that process to help identify the level of risk. We also are trained in helping students develop social skills and creating goals for those students. Again, those behavior interventions. So we do something called a functional behavior analysis. You might have heard of that as an FBA. We analyze a student's behavior if it's kind of interfering with their schooling, and we can help a team to create an intervention plan to help reduce or increase certain behaviors. We're also highly trained in something called social emotional learning, SEL, and how to deliver that on a school-wide level, on a classroom level, and then in group and individual ways. In terms of academics and learning, we're also considered experts in education. We're trained in understanding academic interventions and data analysis. Primarily in terms of academics, we're on the side of helping to identify academic needs and to create and start up interventions for students, and then help track and progress monitor their progress in that intervention to see, is it working? Do we need to modify this? Should we continue this? We're also highly trained in identification of disabilities and in educational laws, really specifically special education and disability laws. We're probably one of the highest trained school staff members in the building around these laws and identifying disabilities. In line with that, we do very comprehensive evaluations. We do IQ testing and testing for learning disabilities. We're able to do evaluations for social and emotional functioning, adaptive skills, as well as academic testing and standardized evaluations. There's really a lot of detail in all of these different topics, and we'll be covering that throughout the School Psych Finds podcast. We also have legal timelines for these evaluations and special education processes. That's what I was referring to earlier about one part of our job that is really stressful because of the shortages in school psychology. These evaluations have to get done one way or the other, and we have legal timelines. These timelines can vary by state, but the average might be something like 60 days. And 60 days sounds like a long time, but it's really not if you understand how many cases we usually have open at once, how many other parts of our job that we have to do at the same time, and how long it really takes to do a comprehensive evaluation, analyze all of that data, and write a legally defensible report about that. I hope this episode helped to give you a better overview and understanding of what a school psychologist is. To be a school psychologist, you have to go through very specific and specialized training, and to be credentialed or licensed by the state you work in. Often get asked a lot of questions about if different types of professionals in related fields, if they can become school psychologists, and my answer is always yes, and we love when that happens, but that doesn't allow you to sidestep the school psychology training and program, again, because it's a highly specialized field. So you would still have to go through probably 2 to 3 years of training to become a school psychologist, even if you're already another type of professional. Please feel free to reach out to me via my social media channels or email. All will be linked in my show notes. I absolutely love hearing from all of you, and I look forward to talking to you next week on our next School Psych Finds episode. Thanks for tuning in to the School Psych Finds podcast. Join our community by subscribing to this podcast and following me on my other channels, which can be found in the show notes. Lastly, if you enjoyed the podcast, it makes a huge difference if you leave a quick review. I'll see you all soon for our next School Psych Finds.